Hey there, Indiana. Scott here. Nature threw a monkey wrench into our plans for tonight. We were supposed to talk with Jessica Bailey, two-term Porter County clerk and Democratic candidate for state comptroller. Unfortunately, severe weather earlier this evening knocked out power to her area, and she is unable to join us. Our thoughts are with everybody affected by the storms, which continue to move across the state this evening. Y'all be safe out there. But I do still have an important conversation to bring you. Last week, I sat down with Brad Meyer, Democratic candidate for Indiana's 9th Congressional District, and Dan Segal, a retired professor of history and anthropology and an activist with Jewish Voice for Peace Indiana. We spent nearly 90 minutes discussing the U.S. relationship with Israel and how to talk about it with voters from across the spectrum. I was going to release this later this week as a bonus episode, but it looks like the fates want us to drop this one tonight. So here it is. Love each other, Indiana. Hello, welcome to a special bonus episode of the Who's Left podcast, a show about Indiana politics, history, and culture from an unapologetically leftist perspective. My name is Scott Aaron Rogers, and I'm recording from Bloomington. So even before October 7th, 2023, but especially since, through the 2024 presidential race, on into this year's primary season, and especially in high-profile intra-party fights like the recent Michigan U.S. Senate Democratic primary between progressive Dr. Abdul El-Sayed and establishment favorite Representative Haley Stevens, the relationship between the United States and Israel, the oversized role that country's lobbying arm plays in U.S. politics, and the Israeli military, government, and people's treatment of their Arab neighbors has become an important litmus test for many American voters. I get asked constantly where candidates stand on Israel and Gaza, sometimes when it's relevant, sometimes when it's not. Somebody in the comments wanted me to grill a Secretary of State candidate about it a few weeks back, and I had to refrain. Not because I don't want to know, I do. And also because I was pressed for time, but it's not within the duties of the Indiana Secretary of State's office. But for a candidate running for Congress, that's a different story. Foreign policy is squarely in that job description, and Hoosiers in Indiana's 9th District, my congressional district, deserve serious discourse, not sound bites. Not that a topic loaded with this much history, emotion, and geopolitical intrigue can be tackled in sound bites. So, in this following presentation, I've got two guests who've already started to have this discussion privately in a respectful, constructive, good faith manner, and thought it important to continue the conversation publicly, modeling that same civil dialogue while giving the subject the space it needs to breathe. Brad Meyer is the Democratic nominee for the U.S. House of Representatives in Indiana's 9th District, running against incumbent Republican Erin Houchin this November. Dan Segal is a retired professor of anthropology and history, a Bloomington resident, and an activist with Jewish Voice for Peace Indiana. He sits on the state coordinating committee for that organization. The two of them don't agree on everything here, and you'll hear that plainly, but the goal of this exercise wasn't debate. It was the kind of nuanced, good faith exchange both of them told me they'd already begun and wanted to continue on the record. Over the next hour and a half, we get into whether what's happening in Gaza meets the definition of genocide, U.S. funding and the defense authorization bill's language tying our defense industry closer to Israel's, the legitimacy of the Israeli state absent equal rights for everyone living under it, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movements, and the apartheid South Africa comparison. And where all of that leaves a Democrat running in a red-leaning Indiana district trying to hold together a coalition that doesn't agree on any of it. It's a lot to cover. And even in this double-stuffed episode, we only begin to scratch the surface. But before this conversation gets underway, this is an independent progressive media project, and we need your support. We don't paywall content, we don't charge candidates for interviews, and we certainly don't have billionaire benefactors. We refuse to hide important information behind paywalls in the middle of a political crisis, even to our financial detriment. So please, if you find value in conversations like this, go to progressiveindiana.net and subscribe at the paid level. It's only $5 a month or $50 a year to help us build the infrastructure that will pop the right-wing media bubble in this state. And while a paid subscription is the best way to help us grow and sustain this project, you can help in other ways by liking and sharing on social media, commenting, leaving reviews, providing feedback, and forwarding our content to your people. Get us when you can. Mostly, we just want you here in this community of Hoosiers dedicated to making the state and its government work for all of us, not just the elite few. Please join us. Follow me on Blue Sky, Instagram, and Threads at whosleft.us and on Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube at Who's Left. Progressive Indiana Network's handle is the full spelled out name on most sites, but on Blue Sky and TikTok, it is PIN Indiana. Please help us grow with a follow wherever you're at. Tell the others. Let's build a radically democratic Indiana together. Now here are Brad Meyer and Dan Segal. All right, here we are this evening for a very special, important conversation. We are recording this on August 5th, 2026, and, just yesterday we had a very important and consequential primary election in several states, but I think the big one, the highlight of the day, was in Michigan, where we saw Dr. Abdul El-Sayed narrowly defeat Representative Haley Stevens in the Michigan senatorial primary. And one of the main points of contention, I think, in that race was the U.S. relationship with Israel. And I get a lot of folks make comments to me about this. I have my very own strong opinions about this issue, and I think in many cases it's relevant. In many cases it's not. I was doing an interview with Greg Ballard. I don't know, a little more than a week ago. What is time? And somebody says in the comments, ask him about Israel. I'm like, this dude's running for Secretary of State of Indiana. That's really not in his purview. And I get why people want to know, sort of where folks stand on the moral issues. But in the end, that's not really something the Secretary of State or your average state house or state Senate candidate can do anything about. The treasurer of the state of Indiana maybe have, some small role to play in terms of like a bond buying and whatnot. But for the most part, this is a federal issue. You are talking about foreign relations between two sovereign states. So it is fair game for a congressional candidate. And Brad, I assume you get this question a lot from folks you are talking to across the political spectrum as you are campaigning for Indiana's 9th Congressional District here. But before we really dig into this conversation, which, before we even start, I think deserves a lot of nuance. It inflames a lot of passions across the board. I think what I'm hoping to achieve in this space is that we discuss this issue with a lot of nuance. So before we begin, I just want both Brad and Dan here to introduce themselves briefly so we know kind of where everybody's coming from. And Brad, I'll ask you to start.
Thank you. So I had suggested this to Scott, and we talked about maybe having Dan join. And the reason is that this does inflame a lot of passion, and there are strong feelings about this issue. And I had a discussion with Dan, and I would say that Dan and I are not 100% aligned on this issue. We're not 100% out of phase either, but there were some differences. And what I really liked about the discussion, and it was frankly a little bit refreshing, is he listened, he made his points, I listened, we went back and forth, we exchanged ideas, we exchanged perspectives. And at this point, I think we need a little less heat and a little bit more dialogue. There is not consensus in Southern Indiana. There's a lot of consensus, frankly, on the Democratic Party side, but I don't think that there is consensus in the Indiana 9th on this, and a little bit of dialogue. And frankly, one of the most common things that come out of discussions that I have that I really didn't hear from Dan was people say, I just don't understand how anybody can look at this and not immediately draw this conclusion. And that is a problem. If we don't understand why people look at the same data that we do and draw different conclusions, we can't talk through with them and address their views, legitimate and illegitimate. Sorry.
And very good. And just for the record, Brad, you are running for Congress here. This is Brad Meyer, running for Congress in Indiana's 9th District. He's the Democratic nominee. And I am also joined here by Dan Segal. Dan Segal is a retired professor of anthropology and history, and also an activist with the Jewish Voice for Peace. Maybe, Dan, do you want to pick up where Brad left off there?
Sure. Let me say that I'm here in Bloomington, Indiana, where this has been my permanent residence since midsummer of 2023, though I was in and out of Bloomington a lot before that. I was born in New York. I'm 68. I'm Jewish. I was born into a large Jewish family in the wake of the Holocaust. And my concern with the genocide is foundational for my understanding of Palestine and Israel today. I am on the State Coordinating Committee for Jewish Voice for Peace, Indiana. That is the Indiana chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. Jewish Voice for Peace is, first of all, the fastest growing Jewish identified organization in the United States. And with some 750,000 activists and supporters, we are also the world's largest progressive pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionist Jewish organization. Not surprisingly, our presence is not huge in Indiana. Indiana doesn't have a large Jewish population. Our presence is huge in New York. We were a day one originary endorser of Zoran Mandani. Our presence is also very large in California, Illinois, places where you would expect, where there are significant Jewish populations. I will add that I too greatly valued the conversation Brad and I had, because we did offer different opinions, but I genuinely could tell that Brad was proceeding from a position of good faith and wanting to express himself, but also deeply willing to listen. And I thought we had a good exchange. So I'm very happy to be back here in this conversation.
And I'm honored to hold this space with the two of you and help foster a deeper discussion about these issues. So, Dan, you said the G word, which a lot of people take issue with when you refer to what Israel has done in Gaza over the last couple of years as a genocide. Now, this is a point that is up for dispute, at least in some circles, though I should mention that, the folks who study these sort of things, and I'm talking about the International Association of Genocide Scholars, the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention, B'Tselem, the leading Israeli human rights organization, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, do all agree on that definition, and you largely hear pushback on that framing of Israel's actions in Gaza since October 7, 2023. You hear a lot of pushback on that from adamantly Zionist organizations in Israel and as well in the United States. And I think it's been a bit, it's a hard road to navigate for folks like Brad, who are out there trying to approach this as he's running this race for Congress, where there are a lot of other issues on the table that matter to Hoosiers in the 9th District. And, a lot of folks are going to say, well, that's a red line. That right there. Can you say what Israel is doing is a genocide? Brad, does this track? Do you get folks say they want to know? Will you say what Israel is doing is a genocide, and that's a red line that where you fall on that is going to determine whether or not I can vote for you?
Yes, there are people that take that position, and I understand and respect that. the real question, or the first question, is this is a brutal war. We are helping to fund it. We are supporting it. Is that in the best interest of the United States, and does it match our values and priorities? And the answer is no. That is the bottom line for me. And I guess I'll add one more clause to that. It is in the best interest of the United States that there be a lasting and just peace in that area. It's not in America's best interest to continue these continuous cycles of violence and repression and reprisal, and violence and repression and reprisal. And I don't see today any movement or any off ramp to this continuing cycle. What we are supporting today will give birth to the next generation of violence. Pick a number, 12 years from now. Okay. And then that will give birth to the next generation of violence 10 years later, and so on and so forth. And what people want is they want a simple soundbite that they can say, okay, done, we're in agreement. And what we need to understand what the depth of the problem is. We need to understand both sides. That doesn't mean we have to agree or sympathize. We just need to understand the motivations of both sides, and how do we move forward. And the question of genocide, typically the International Justice Court takes years and years to make a decision, years after the fact, after everybody is dead and buried, and it no longer has an impact on the ground. And we need to focus on how do we make things better now, and how do we move us in a direction that things are better. And I'm not going to take years to make a decision to say that we need to stop funding something that's in no one's best interest. But I'm not prepared to say it's a genocide. That doesn't mean I support what they're doing. That doesn't mean that I am a Zionist. That doesn't mean that I am reflexively Israeli or reflexively supportive of Israel.
You brought it to funding, which I think is an important component of this in a lot of people's minds, because without the support of the United States and taxpayer funds, Israel couldn't go on doing whatever it is they're doing, whatever you want to call it. Dan, what do you say to what Brad just had to say?
I'd like to address two different points. One, I don't want to certainly have the interview dwell on the question of genocide, but I also don't want to ignore it. So I want to speak to it, and I'm not sure after that, if Brad has more to say, I'm welcome to hear it, but I will try to say what I have to say. Mm-hmm. The first thing, as I said before, I was raised in a large Jewish New York family in the wake of the Holocaust. There were people on my block, which was a Jewish neighborhood, with Auschwitz numbers on their arms. I saw that as a child. My closest friend in the world, who I've known since I'm a teenager and who I'm still very close to, has never known his aunts and uncles, grandparents. All of them died in the camps. And what my parents and grandparents, may their memories be for blessings, taught me was that never again is for everybody. It's not just for Jews. And that if there was ever anything unfolding again that was like the Holocaust, my obligation, my Jewish obligation, was to do everything I could to stop it. And that is why I have been supporting freedom and equality for Palestinians my adult life. Because, and I'll say one more thing about the genocide, and then I will make this point. I think the root cause here is that the Israeli state, since it came into existence in 1948, has on a daily basis denied freedom and equality to Palestinians. When you oppress people, they often resist. They resist. Sometimes that resistance takes the form of violence. I've never advocated violence or been able to participate in it, But I understand Martin Luther King's point that when people complained about the violence of urban uprisings in the 1960s, he said, why are you more concerned with the violence by young Black people in our cities than the violence done to them every day that has driven them to desperation? And I think the root cause here is the violence of the Israeli state in denying people's freedom and equality. I've traveled twice to Palestine, primarily into the West Bank, but also into Palestinian areas inside the recognized borders of Israel. I've seen, experienced, and shared the kinds of denials of freedom that Palestinians suffer on a daily basis in the West Bank. This was in 17 and 23. I will simply say on the genocide, as Scott said, every major human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, the Jewish Israeli human rights organization, has studied the evidence and concluded that this is a genocide. Usually the reservations are on the question of intent. And I will say that particularly the Amnesty International report does, to my mind, an overwhelming case in documenting that this is the intent of the Netanyahu government and not just something that has happened irresponsibly in waging war on Gaza. So I'm convinced it's a genocide, and I would urge anybody to read B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Al-Haq, the Human Rights Organization of Palestinian Society, extremely rigorous report. Read the finding of the International Court of Justice that has not, as Brad mentioned, has not concluded that Israel is guilty, but has concluded it is probable that there is a genocide. And it takes much, not because they've found otherwise, but because, as Brad said, it takes the ICJ much longer. And because that process is so long, it would be unethical for us to wait.
Correct.
That's too late. That's an important subsequent moment after the fact of reparations. But we are obliged, even at the moment when there's, at a minimum, a plausible case, to intervene as human beings and stop it. Never again is for everybody. Now, in terms of a way forward, this may sound surprising. I am not as, I would say, I heard Brad somewhat fatalistic, and he's certainly right to worry that the current violence that Palestinians have experienced in Gaza, life expectancy in Gaza has been diminished by something like 30 years since October 23 by the mass murder of people. But I also know the kind of violence that's going on in the West Bank. These are pogroms, just as my grandfather experienced in 1906 in the Pale of Settlement. And the concern, which is not an illegitimate one, is that when you treat people with this kind of violence, that there'll be a counter violence later on.
Yes.
I think there is a way to break this. I think that what we need is to establish, and I know this may sound really radical, something that I think is the best part of our US political tradition. There has to be a commitment to full equality and freedom for all human beings in Palestine and Israel. Full stop.
Agreed.
And if you want Palestinians to build a commitment to live in peace with the Jewish Israelis there is one crucial thing. Palestinians as human beings deserve equality and freedom, and when they are accorded equality and freedom, I believe that will break the cycle. They are struggling for equality and freedom, and I am Palestinian in the sense that I am pro-Palestinian, excuse me, I'm not Palestinian. I'm pro-Palestinian in the sense that I believe that all people suffering from state oppression have a right to struggle for freedom and equality, and that we ought to offer them solidarity, particularly the form of solidarity that Palestinians have asked for is that we commit to doing no harm as the United States. That means we end supplying $3.8 billion per year in murderous weapons to the Israeli government. That is a crucial form of solidarity that I am committed to, ending the US funding. I will mention that in the current defense authorization bill, there is actually a new deeply problematic provision, which is to tie the U.S. and Israeli defense industries together so that we would be sharing and producing weapons with Israel. That seems to me not in the best interest of the United States, not in the best interest of the world, not in the best interest of Palestinians. It seems to me to be a terrible provision. So those are what I think members of Congress need to do. Stop providing Israel weapons of mass destruction or the funds of $3.8 billion for them, and to absolutely block this new, really terrible provision in the defense bill that is before Congress at this time.
Yeah, and that's Section 219 of the National Defense Authorization Act, and I think it's under a different name in the House bill, but regardless, a lot there, Dan, and Brad, no matter what you call what has been going on there, genocide or ethnic cleansing or war crimes, it's all bad. Like, no matter what name you give it, it's not good, and we should not, as the United States, as Israel's largest sponsor, should not be sanctioning, condoning, funding, or abetting what they have been doing. Congress and the president have leverage in that regard that I think they're not using. You are running for Congress. What would you like to see your hopeful colleagues be doing in response to this situation? Where should our lawmakers be using their leverage in this case?
So I want to respond to a couple of important points that Dan made, and then having done that, then I can respond to your question more effectively. So one of the first points, and this is, I think, where a lot of people in the district get stuck, is they don't differentiate between who started the war and what caused the war. And I think that Dan's point, using the analogy of Martin Luther King, what caused the riots versus what caused the people to riot. There are a lot of people that are stuck and stop listening, and they say Hamas started the war, and that is a true statement. But then you have to look one step deeper and say what caused the circumstances that they would start a war, right? And that's a question that I think many people in Indiana don't have a direct tie to. They have not a deep understanding of the issues that are leading to these cycles of violence. And there's a long history, and when I say it's a long history, the history is really 120 years. A lot of people just assume that it's 2,000 years old. That is actually not a true statement. The Philistines were completely wiped out. They are not the same as the Palestinians. This is not a continuation of a biblical argument that has been going on for 2,500 years. This is something that is really rooted about 120 years deep. Now, 120 years is a long time, and it's deep enough that it needs to be taken seriously in historical context. But understanding the root cause of this conflict and the history behind it is important for people to be able to make a good judgment of how they feel. And for some, everything that is said after who started the war is dismissed. And if we just look at it that way, we're never going to find our way to a just and lasting peace, right? And the funding today, well, not today, we'll say back in October, a couple of years ago, the strongest armed people were going to brutalize the other side if they could. And I think the other thing, and this is not making apologies for Israel, but it's a question that I think really has to be answered or addressed. And I think it's high on the mind of many people that aren't in the debate directly. If you scale the attack from October to the American population, it would be 40,000 people killed and 9,000 people taken hostage. And we would burn the world to the ground if that happened to us. And there are people that are indifferent as a result of that. And I think that we need to be able to address, if this happened to us, no, we would not approach it the way Israel is approaching it. And we also have to differentiate between what the Netanyahu government is doing and support of Israel as a sovereign state. And I think that all gets lost in the discussion as well. To tie, and then the last point that Dan made is tying the Israeli defense industry in tighter with the United States. I am not in favor of that. We have 5 countries, including us, that are in Five Eyes, which is the tightest relationship that we have with countries. And Israel is not part of Five Eyes, and I don't think that we should draw ourselves closer because it's not in our strategic best interest to make that a tighter relationship. From a congressional point of view, now coming to your question, Scott, we need to apply diplomatic pressure, and part of that is economic and funding pressure to Israel to get the Netanyahu government to look for an alternative to the brutal war that they're pursuing. And that is one of the things people want: short answers, right? They want me to say no money at all for Israel, and that is not practical. Certainly defensive aid and other economic aid. Israel has provided aid to us in the Middle East. We need to preserve them as an ally, but we need them to change their course. And how do you do that is not a black and white issue. It is an issue of more than just diplomacy. It has to be. We have to push harder than certainly we are now, and we can't reflexively give everything they want every time they ask for it. We don't do that with other allies. We don't even do that with England. So,
Go ahead, Dan.
I think Brad did an excellent job reporting on how many people in this district and elsewhere think about it. They start with October 7th and they say Hamas attacked Israel. But history didn't begin on October 7th, right? And we have to look before that. So let's look at the situation. In 23, there were roughly, today it's 14 million, roughly 13 million people living in the area on the map that you would see designated as Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. 13 million. About half of them Jewish Israelis, about half of them Palestinians. How many countries are there? How many governments? One. We live with a single state reality in Palestine and Israel. It is an Israeli state that is not a Jewish state. It is an Israeli state that is a Jewish supremacist state. Why do I say it's a Jewish supremacist state? Of the half of the population that is Palestinian, those who live within the recognized borders of Israel, I believe it's about 2 million of them, are second-class citizens the way African Americans were under Jim Crow. They are prohibited from buying, renting, or living in roughly 90% of the land within the borders of Israel. That makes them second-class citizens. They have significant limits on their freedom of speech and movement. That makes them second-class citizens. So some of those Palestinians under the rule of the Israeli state are citizens, but they're second-class citizens. For the rest, those living in Gaza and Palestine, so another 4.5 or 5 million, depending on the year, they don't have citizenship, and they don't have freedom, and they didn't have freedom before 2023. In Gaza, they lived under an illegal blockade and siege. For instance, all of their water facilities to produce drinkable water had been bombed by the Israeli state, and they were prohibited from rebuilding them. They had an economy that grew most of their own calories, but the requirements for that and the possibility of that had been blocked by the Israeli state. They were living in the world's largest open-air prison. They were desperate.
Mm-hmm.
A few years before, there'd been a powerful nonviolent movement, the Gaza March, the Great March of Return, in which leading civil society figures urged Gazans to walk to the border wall and demand to be able to return to their grandparents' homes, and a demand that the Gaza separation wall be torn down and they have freedom of movement. The Israeli army lined up at that and shot them. The organizers of that, including a dear person who I had the opportunity to meet, a wonderful poet, a Gazan poet, specifically asked Hamas not to participate. Think how little press that brilliant, nonviolent pursuit of freedom for Gazans, think of how little attention it got in the United States, how little uptake it got, how little support. So history didn't begin on October 7th.
Agreed.
There is decades of oppression of a particular form in Gaza that led people to heroic nonviolent resistance, and tragically on October 7th led them also to desperate violent resistance. I don't approve of that. I don't celebrate that, but I understand it, and I also don't condemn it. I understand that people out of desperation do desperate things, and the solution is not to wipe them off the face of the earth. The solution is to understand their desperation and support their aspirations for freedom and equality. The West Bank is a different form of no freedom, but in the West Bank after 67, a system has been built in which, if you live in a town of Bloomington, and I traveled in the West Bank, you are not free to exit Bloomington without going through a checkpoint where a 17 or 18-year-old Jewish Israeli has a gun and determines whether you can leave that to go visit your grandmother in Bedford or Ellettsville, and in which there's no appeal. The 17 or 18 or 19-year-old with that gun, which we've paid for, is the state at that checkpoint. And I've been in the homes with Palestinian children who've seen those 17 and 18 and 19-year-olds with the gun pointed at their uncle when they've asked to go visit or to get to school. Okay, you cannot treat people like that and not expect desperation. And the other thing to say about that 17, 18, 19-year-old Jewish Israeli with the gun, not only did we pay for it, but in a number of cases, as I know myself from going to those checkpoints with Palestinians and talking to them, a lot of those young men are actually from Long Island or Brooklyn. And yet they can hold a gun and keep my friend from accompanying their children to school if it's on the other side of the checkpoint. So history did not begin with October 7th.
Agreed.
And we have to recognize that what was set up in 1948 was never a legitimate state. Why do I say that? Never a legitimate country. I think it is basic to legitimacy for any sovereign state that it provide equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment. I deeply believe in the 14th Amendment. I would not want to live in a society here without it. And as a Jewish American, I am sure that the 14th Amendment and its guarantee of equal protection of the law is part of why my grandparents, when they emigrated here, could thrive here, because there was, equal protection under the law. The Israeli state is not a legitimate state. No state that treats some of the people it rules as more than other than the people than it rules is a legitimate state. Whatever you want to call it, the state there will be legitimate when it provides equal protection under the law, full equality and full freedom for everybody. That's not about doing any harm to Jewish Israelis. It's about treating all the people who live under that one state reality with equal human rights. And I'll add one other thing. As a Jew who traveled in Palestine, I never experienced anti-Semitism, and I do not think there is some fundamental commitment throughout Palestinian society to eliminating Jews. There is a fundamental commitment that I learned of in Palestine to eliminating inequality and the denial of Palestinian freedom.
A lot there, and Brad, I'm going to come to you in just a second.
Yes,
I'm going to sort of set this up, but Dan goes back to the founding of Israel in 1948 and the way it was set up under the UN, and going back before that to the British mandate and the way after World War I, when the Ottomans who ruled the area that is now Israel and Palestine previously, and under whom Jews and Arabs and Christians in the area generally lived in mostly peaceful coexistence, but then you have the British Mandate and the founding of Israel in 1948, and very much in the way I think in the United States, I can point to all of our problems over the last 40 years, and I say it's all Reagan's fault. If you want to zoom out further than that and go back to like what's wrong with the world, it's all the British Empire's fault, and that land that is now Israel wasn't Britain's to give away in the first place, and I've always sort of viewed what we have in Israel as an extension, like the dangling, the appendix, if you will, of the British Empire. All after World War II, all of their colonies were, gradually granted independence. Not the Palestinians. You still had the larger, and I'll call it what it is. I'll say it's a white supremacist project at work in Israel. With the British and the Americans and the Israelis, now the new colonial force there. But I mentioned Reagan, Brad. Isn't the way that we treat Israel now, and we say, listen, I know what they're doing is wrong. We wish they wouldn't act this way. We wish they'd rein it in and behave more responsibly. But listen, they're an important ally, and it's a strategic, important part of the world. Isn't that the way, like, the Reagan administration and previous Republicans talked about our relationship with apartheid South Africa? And we look at it now, and we're horrified, and we're like, oh my God, those guys were on the wrong side of history. Isn't that how people are going to look at us now in 50 years?
We'll see 50 years from now. I will say that there's a whole lot of points that Dan brought up, and this is why I really enjoyed the conversation with Dan the first time, and we're getting to go back through some of it. He cited historical incidents that are I was going to say complimentary, but that implies a tone that I'm not trying to strike. That explain the Palestinian point of view. And the fact is that there are, and they're legitimate. And then you talk to other people on the other side of the argument, and they're going to point to other historical arguments. And then you have this tit for tat and say, well, the Palestinians did this. And they say, but the Israelis did this. And then the Palestinians did this. And what they're looking at is they're zooming in too close to a specific, and I'm not saying you are, Dan, but they're zooming in and looking at one piece of one event to support their narrative. And if you step back and look at the big picture is this is structurally not sustainable. It is not structurally a stable arrangement as it is now. It is not just prone to violence, but it will always produce more violence and more repression and more injustice and more of what we're seeing now, which is the same thing that we saw a decade or decades ago, which we saw in previous wars. This is structurally not stable, and it goes back to the founding, right? I agree with that. And I think that we get caught up when we're trying to have a dialogue with one side or the other, that they will pick the arguments that support their support for one side. And I think intellectually, honestly, we have to look at both sides and both sets of data and say, there is a structural problem. And the structural problem is that Israel is on what they call death ground, which means that, or the Netanyahu government views this, that they either have to win or they will die and they'll be destroyed. This is, and when people view their circumstances like this, all options narrow toward violence. And the only thing that you have available is a hammer. And it has been the official policy and the demonstrated policy of the Netanyahu government and previous governments in Israel, that if they are attacked, they are going to not react proportionally. They are going to react with overwhelming violence to secure their safety so that they feel safe. And in that environment, they're never going to feel safe, which means they're always going to be driven toward violence. And it is the perspective that they have on their situation that is part of the reason that I was going back before that I was saying the causes. This is the underlying cause, is that the Netanyahu government believes that they are on death ground. And when people are on that, they will do things that they would never do under other circumstances. And conversely, on the other side, the Palestinians are rightfully, Dan has absolutely accurately described the inhumanity that the Palestinians live with. And they are on a very similar psychological perspective of death ground, that they are trapped, that they can't, there's nowhere else for them to go. It's not like the other, when there was the diaspora of the Palestinians after the 58 war and subsequent wars, they were not welcomed into surrounding communities and integrated into their communities. They were put in camps. And I remember as a kid, the Palestinian camps. And so it's not like they have an option that they could leave and go. I'm not saying they should. They don't even have an option of going somewhere else and starting a new life and just giving up on their claim. They're stuck. So now you've got people that are stuck and people that believe they're on death ground. And as long as we have that dynamic, and as long as the United States continues to fund one side of that and not try to influence that dynamic, we're going to have this problem. And if the United States removes themselves, then Israel is as long as Israel is in that mindset, they will find a way to do what they're doing right now with the U.S. or without the U.S. And we've got to get past this endless cycle. And that is a really hard issue.
There's key parts of what Brad said that I will agree with. Israel has tried to create safety and what it calls security, and particularly safety and security for Jews, only through military domination and oppression. And it has made Israel one of the least safe places in the world for Jews. And so it is a failed means to the ostensible end of creating safety and security for Jews. Israel's not safe for Jews. King distinguished between negative and positive peace. Positive peace is not just the absence of violence, it's the presence of justice,
yes,
equality, and freedom. And I would submit that more fundamental than that fear of annihilation that Brad talked about on the part of the Netanyahu government, the Netanyahu state, more fundamental to the lack of a positive peace is the commitment of Zionism to supremacism, to denying Palestinian freedom and equality. That is the fundamental cause. There must be a demand and a support from the United States for equality and freedom, full human rights for all Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, completely equally.
Agreed.
And I believe that when that occurs, we will break the cycle of violence.
Yes.
And people have freedom and equality and an opportunity to live a dignified life. They are not desperate. They do not strike out in violence. And when people are living with other people and affording them freedom and equality and human dignity, they do not have to fear retribution. And so I do think that that should be the bottom line from the United States. We need to say that what we are committed to is human rights, full equality, and freedom. And I think we need to show that we mean that by providing the Israeli state weapons of mass murder, weapons of genocide, I believe. And I don't agree, Brad, that if we remove those, that Israel will find some other means. $3.8 billion in weapons of mass murder are not easily replaced. I think, I do think that what can we do? Well, one of the things I would like to do, and personally, I'm probably not in a position to do it, but there is a call for lots of Americans, including Jewish Americans, to join the olive harvest this year and to bear protective witnessing and protective presence. I think that, I would love to be in the West Bank this fall, standing with Palestinians harvesting their olives, because while it might put me in some danger, I do think if we get enough of us standing there as witnesses for peace, it will make it much less likely and harder for Israel to brutally murder more Palestinians. But I think that we do need to remove the means they have and to make Israel recognize that it's not going to get more, and that will bring them to the negotiating table. The scholarship on this, Nathan Thrall's book, The Only Language They Understand, has shown that the very few times when Israel has started to provide some compromise and recognition of the rights of Palestinians has been in those rare historic moments when the United States has put pressure on Israel. Israel doesn't feel more secure by getting more weapons. It feels more unaccountable and more free to use those weapons to kill more Palestinians. Israel, it does not, that theory that J Street has and that the Biden administration had, that you promise Israel that we will stand with them and they won't feel that they have an existential threat. They won't feel that they're on death row, and then they will do the right thing. It has been tried and tried and tried. It has failed and failed and failed. It leads to more and more death and suffering in Palestinians. What will get Israel out of that? Knowing that they can't rely on an endless supply of weapons, they have to negotiate, and pressing Israel to do what all sovereign states must do to provide full freedom and equality, fully equal protection under the law.
So I guess what's the way out of this? You hear various solutions bandied about between sides, and for the longest time I feel like in the United States it was, we got to have a two-state solution, right? We need the Israeli state needs to be secure in its borders with its Jewish majority, and then there also needs to be a sovereign Palestinian state that has its own self-determination, and then the question is, all right, well, what are the borders? Who decides the borders? Is it 73? Is it 67? Is it 48? What do you do about the settlements that are there now? It just opens up a whole can of worms. And I think in more recent times, and I think what I hear you describing, Dan, is a single state with universal human rights for everybody. Brad, I want to hear your thoughts on this. I'm going to drop off the screen. I'm going to stay listening. I'll be back in 2 minutes, but you keep talking.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I do want to disagree with Dan on one point, that defunding Israel will force them to a peaceful solution. The fact is, and I think it was the Rwandan genocide, in a period of a couple of months, they killed hundreds of thousands of people with machetes, right? They didn't have sophisticated weapons that they could target They went in with machetes and they just hacked hundreds of thousands of people to death. And if you put Israel on death ground and they feel that they are really an immediate threat, we may be shocked at what the response is to that. The other thing, and I think, Dan, you made a really good point, and you made it several times, and I wanted to acknowledge it. You're talking about the 14th Amendment and justice. That is the end state. That's how it's going to have to be in order for there to be a just and lasting peace and an end to this cycle. One of the things that I think many of us don't understand and appreciate is that there are hardliners on both sides that stoke these flames and keep that help to perpetuate this. And as long as there's hardliners on both sides, getting to that just end state is going to be difficult. And one of the things when you talk about support of Israel, we need to, in my opinion, we should support Israel, but we should not be supporting the hardliners in the Netanyahu government and those that are supporting the Netanyahu government. And you talked about the peace march by the Palestinians, but there was also significant riots, but demonstrations on the Israeli side that the Israeli people were not happy with what was happening in their government. And that was before October, right? The October attack. So there's a lot of discontent in that. And one of the things that one of the reasons I'm trying to be more measured and thoughtful is I was talking to a rabbi and she said, I don't feel like I have a home in the Democratic Party anymore. I'm a Democrat, but I don't feel, I feel unwelcomed, and I disagree with the Republicans, and I am stuck without a political position, and I think that there are a lot of people that feel that way, and we need to. More important than defunding military, we need to end support for hardliners inside of Israel that are perpetuating it from that side. And the hardliners on the other side, on the Palestinian side, that's a difficult problem. Right, and I think that that most of the hardliners have been subdued militarily, and there's going to be a long period of trust building that's going to happen. And the main thing, Scott, you were talking about, what is the right answer? And the right answer is that the Israelis and the Palestinians need to figure out what a just and lasting peace looks like. And as long as one side or the other is, as a majority of the population, seeing that a military solution or a violent solution is the path forward, we're never going to get there. The only thing the United States can do is to help lay the groundwork and facilitate that peace process. And right now, we're not doing that. We are purely partisan, and no Palestinian is going to see the United States as an honest broker. So our influence on half of this is gone. Therefore, we're just lost as far as being an honest broker to help foster peace.
And a lot of that goes to the Trump administration has sort of squandered what international reputation the United States had over its terms. But I want to speak to your rabbi friend there, Brad, and I respect what she had to say. She's distinctly in the minority within Democratic circles, certainly, obviously, as she mentioned, the vast majority of Democratic-leaning voters at this point, have a negative favorability or a negative view of the state of Israel. But it is not distinct. It is not limited to Democrats or the vague U.S. left, whatever there is of it. Independents and even the majority of Republicans under the age of 50 at this point have a disfavorable view of Israel. And this is swung wildly just in the last couple of years. And it is precisely because of the way they are acting in relation to their neighbors. And, we talk about Netanyahu a lot, and this particular Netanyahu government, which is populated with far-right figures like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir and others, but they are not super outside of the norm of thought in Israel. Like, what passes for an opposition there is opposed to Netanyahu's corruption, but are largely on board with the way that the Israeli government is treating their neighbors. Dan's shaking his head.
And I want to add, and I want to come back to your rabbi. I would love to introduce you to the rabbis on the Rabbinical Council of Jewish Voice for Peace. Particularly when you're looking at younger Jews, we now have a larger percentage of younger Jews under 35 or 40, depending upon which polling you look at, who no longer are supporting Israel as a Jewish supremacist state, who are more supportive of Palestinians in the struggle than they are of Israel. I am a Jewish American. I spent the fall campaigning in the most Jewish city in the country from Zoran Mamdani, who shares the view that Israel as a Jewish supremacist state does not have a right to exist. All states get legitimacy from adopting a commitment to human rights and equal rights, full freedom, full equality for everybody.
That is our values.
And I, you talk about the Democratic Party. I've never voted for a Republican. It's hard for me to imagine voting for a Republican. I went to Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. I spent it marching outside of it, demanding that the Harris team end its support for the genocide, demanding that the Harris team allow a Palestinian to speak from the convention floor. Last night, the leader of the None of the Above movement in Michigan got elected to the Michigan State House. So I submit that your rabbi is an N of one and not typical of Jewish Democratic voters any longer. And there will be fewer and fewer of them. And that I'd be happy to talk to that rabbi, but I know a lot of other rabbis. The way to get to a peace process is to establish full equality and freedom. In fact, there's no peace process. It has been no peace process because one side is a nuclear-armed state backed to the hilt with weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass murder by the United States. The other are stateless people denied their freedom and equality. There can be no negotiations with such asymmetry of power. There's never been a peace process. The peace process will begin when people can come to the table with equality. That has to end the overwhelming military advantage that the state has over a stateless people. And I think that depriving Israel of a capacity to prop up its illegitimate, corrupt, and anti-human, pro-genocide government, depriving it of the military force that holds it up, is what will bring Israel to the negotiating table. The other thing I want to fully echo and amplify Scott's point, the opposition in Israel, whether you're talking about in the Knesset, the people running against Netanyahu in the upcoming election, or you're talking about the overwhelming protesters against the Netanyahu government. They are repulsed by the corruption of the Netanyahu government. They may have disagreements with the Netanyahu government over such things as whether women should be able to pray at the wall, et cetera, et cetera. But there is no daylight between the opposition political leaders in Jewish Israeli society and Netanyahu on denying freedom and equality to Palestinians. That is not where you're gonna find peace partners. On the other hand, while there is violent resistance, there's also lots and lots of nonviolent resistance in Palestinian civil society. The largest form of resistance from Palestinian civil society in this century has been the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which has called upon the rest of the world to support the same nonviolent techniques of boycotts and divestments that brought down Jim Crow and brought down the South African government, and led the United States finally to adopt the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, I believe it was of 1986, vetoed by the right-wing extremist Ronald Reagan, and then passed by Congress, overcoming Reagan's veto. And when there were sanctions on the South African government, an end to the props that we had supporting the South African government, the South African government came to the negotiating table. They called up Nelson Mandela in Robben Island and said, "We're ready to negotiate with you." That's the historical experience. BDS, boycotts from civil society, divestment from civil society, and sanctions by the United States, the end of military support and other sanctions, brought the white supremacist apartheid government to the negotiating table and led to a free South Africa. And that's what will happen in Israel. It has to include the sanctions of ending the military support. And when Jewish Israelis and Palestinians come to the negotiating table as equals, without a nuclear weapon and without $3.8 billion of weapons of mass murder on one side against a stateless people on the other, they can negotiate however many states they want, and I'm cool with it. If they want a single state with equal rights, I'm cool with it. If they want 2 states, 23 states, 7.5 states, that's not my business. That's the business of the people on the ground to negotiate, but they can't negotiate until there's freedom and equality for everybody. And what will bring the Israeli side to the negotiating table is ending what is keeping them thinking they can get peace through force, our supplying of the force.
So if you want to play, and Brad, I think I'll come to you in just a second here. If you want to play the realpolitik of it, though, right? I think what Brad, as a guy who's spent his time in national defense circles, right, is worried about, like, oh well, okay, if we withdraw support for Israel, they're going to turn to Russia, they're going to turn to China, they're going to find their arms somewhere else in this sort of great power struggle that we're in the midst of. Is that one of your concerns there, Brad?
That's part of it. South Africa is a good example of a transition from a people that were brutally suppressing, not a minority, but actually the majority, and they felt that brutal suppression was the only way that a minority could control a majority. And at some point, they said, you know what? It is in our best interest to find peace, right?
But Brad, to Dan's point, they didn't just come to this realization. They were pressured into that realization.
They were pressured into that realization. But there's one additional thing. South Africa didn't fear that Botswana would attack them if they let their guard down. And when you talk about, from an American point, from American policy point of view, to say we're going to completely stop funding Israel because we're focused over here on this conflict and this flank of conflict and potential risk that Israel faces. The people that attacked us on 9/11 and the people that think that way are still out there. And if you say none of those people exist in Palestine, I'm not going to argue for or against that. If you say that none of them are there are other actors that would dearly love to attack a weakened Israel, and that has been the experience that they have. And until you, and I know I keep saying it, until you can help them see a way to get off of death ground, that it's not just their fight with the Palestinians, it's their fight with their other neighbors. Until that happens, they are going to react the same way every time. They are going to act disproportionately, and they're going to keep fighting until the other side drops. Okay.
So
that is an extremely hard problem. And I'm not saying that I have the answer today. All I'm saying is that we have to understand the dynamics that are really going into what's causing this long-term problem and start working to break that down.
Israel believes it can prop up an unjust supremacist state because it has an endless supply of arms. When it is deprived of those arms, it will know it has to negotiate. And when it negotiates, that will be the conditions of a positive peace in King's terms. As Scott said, South Africa didn't just come to the conclusion that continuing a white supremacist apartheid system was not in the South African white government came to that conclusion not out of some epiphany. They came to it only after the United States Congress passed over Ronald Reagan's veto, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. Brutal, oppressive regimes depend upon weapons of mass murder. We shouldn't give them to them. We shouldn't be giving them to other brutal, oppressive regimes. We shouldn't be giving them to Saudi Arabia either. The most oppressive, I would say, there's some terrible regimes in this world, but two of the worst regimes in this world are the Israeli state and the Saudi state. Both depend upon our financial, military, and diplomatic support. Saudi Arabia is ruled by a guy who ordered the execution and dismemberment of a critical journalist in their own embassy in Turkey. And we are doing business with him. The ethics are wrong, and you get brutal regimes to back down by not providing them the means to be brutal regimes.
Yeah, and Dan, you
build peace, and you rebuild. You want the United States to have some influence with Palestinian society. Respond to what the BDS movement is asking. What is the BDS movement? I regard it as one of the most morally inspirational movements in the contemporary world. I've had the privilege of meeting in Palestine with its leaders. And what they say is, do no harm. Let us pursue a struggle for freedom and equality and stop giving the people, the state, denying us freedom and equality, its weapons of mass murder, its surveillance systems that are blocking our pursuit of freedom and equality. The BDS movement has been a profoundly nonviolent movement. And I say to anybody who condemns October 7th, that if you didn't respond to the call for nonviolent solidarity from the BDS movement or from the Gaza Great March of Return, then you are violence's true acolyte. If you don't respond to people who are waging peace and asking you for solidarity with peace, then you can't complain when violence breaks out. And so I think that's what our obligation in the United States is. The BDS movement is asking us to do no harm, no longer provide an oppressive supremacist state with its weapons of mass murder and weapons of mass surveillance, which are crucial for operating the apartheid system. And I believe that when the Israeli state is deprived of those, it will have its white South Africa moment and recognize it's in its best interest to come to the negotiating table.
A lot there, Dan, and regarding the BDS movement, in which I generally support, it has been declared illegal in several U.S. states, and I want to say the Trump administration wants to make it illegal at the federal level. But to the point of U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and some of the other states in that region, Egypt is a U.S. ally. Brad.
Yeah,
And I'm coming to you in just a second here.
We're an hour and 16 minutes into it. Let's not expand the discussion too far aside from this one topic. But go ahead.
Yes, but so you mentioned Saudi Arabia. You mentioned, and I want to bring up Egypt. I want to bring up Jordan. I want to bring up all of the other U.S. allies in the region. I think the United States has some sway against those countries that, Brad, you were afraid that, that Israel is afraid would invade it if they didn't have these weapons. Well, the U.S. has a lot to say about that, too, because we're also supplying weapons to Egypt and supplying weapons to Jordan, the very neighbors that could invade, that maybe we didn't have such sway over the last time that Israel went to formal war with its Arab neighbors. So I don't know if that's as much of a concern now. Boy, and I hate to give credit to the Trump regime, but they do, and there are plenty of corrupt intentions involved in all of this, but they are trying to get these other Arab countries on board with Israel's existence to maybe relieve some of that external pressure on them. And don't get me wrong, the Trump administration is no friend or no diplomatic experts, but at least in that regard, they do seem to be maybe taking some of that pressure off from the sides. I don't know. Am I reading this wrong? I hate to give them any credit. But.
Well, so I'm going to channel Dan for just a moment. Okay, I'll see if I can do this justice. The Trump government, the Trump administration, is setting up a more stable environment for a brutal Netanyahu government. Okay, and that is not necessarily something to laud. It is something to recognize. For me, I get it. If we completely defunded Israel, if we said not another farthing goes to Israel, there are three possible outcomes. It would force them to the table to negotiate, as Dan suggested it would. It would drive them to a response that they no longer have the military wherewithal to do this in a, I was going to say surgical, but they're not doing anything surgically. We'll end up with another Rwanda where a shocking number of people are killed with machetes because that's what they have available and they're on death ground. Or number three, they will be attacked from the outside because they're weak enough that they can be attacked. 2 out of 3 options are not in the best interest of a current ally to the United States. And that current ally right now, the Netanyahu government, I'm not a big fan of, right? It is an unjust and brutal government. And we need 2 out of 3 options don't come out the way we think and hope they would. That's
if they're equally probable, Brad. Then it's a 2-to-1. Why do I trust in the first?
Yeah.
Whose lives are most immediately on the line? In particularly your second option, Palestinians.
Yes.
They're there. I have never, all the time I was in Palestine, all the Palestinian leaders I've met in the United States, they are not unaware or unable to reason the way you reason. And every one of them says, we would trust our future and the future of our children to the first option. Please stop giving this state its weapons of mass murder. I think they have not just skin, they have lives and their children's lives in the game. And I think they are in a better position to know that that is their best option at this time. And I respect that. I respect their knowledge, expertise, and insights on the ground. So I think that's part of why. If I will tell you, it is not my place to tell Palestinians what's in their best interest. If they said to me, Dan, or if, I was part of the struggle of solidarity against the white supremacist apartheid in South Africa. If the ANC had said, your boycott might drive the white state to treat us worse, I would have dropped it in a moment. I am accountable to the people who are suffering the oppression. I am not. So, I don't tend to know better than they do what's best for their lives.
So you cut in with a point, and I accept the logic of what you're saying for option number 2. Option number 3, the history better than I do. Israel had an attack from the outside crossing borders in 56. Was it 56?
Okay, okay. It's
and
not
then again,
quite how I'd frame it, but let's say yes.
Yeah, all right. And then again in 67, correct?
Even less how I'd frame it, but go ahead.
And again in 73.
Okay.
Again, I think there were some after. My only point is that this is an important issue, and sometimes things take an unexpected turn. And I'm not saying that I want to give them carte blanche, anything they want. I'm just saying I want us to see, and I guess we've been at this long enough, I should probably do a summation of my position.
Can I just quickly respond to your third scenario on accepting your premise?
Sure. Yes, sir.
There I'll pick up on Scott's point. If it's Egypt or Jordan that you're worried about invading, cut off their weapons too. And who said that in the last 2 days? The great Democratic nominee for Senate from the great Midwestern state of Michigan, Abdul El-Sayed. He was advocating, as I am, ending our providing weapons of mass murder to a supremacist state. And the interviewer played what we both agreed we're not going to play gotcha, and said, well, you certainly only apply that principle selectively. What about all the military we applied to Egypt, the country your ancestors came from? And he said, cut it off. And he said, now you called me anti-Semitic when I said we're going to stop providing weapons of mass murder to Israel. You're now going to call me anti-Egyptian. So I think the United States has to get out of the business of supplying weapons to prop up oppressive regimes everywhere. We have to get out of the business of being arms dealers to the world. We sold arms to Osama bin Laden when we thought he would resist the Soviets in Afghanistan. He took those weapons and applied them to us. What do we need? We need gun control, and we need weapons of mass murder control. So I think we can deal with number 3 by being principled in a commitment to ending the grotesque U.S. military flooding of the world and propping up oppressive regimes. And so I'm back to option number 1. Am I sure it will work? Is there any, guarantees in life? It's a terrible situation right now. There will, Brad, you're not wrong. There will be additional violence no matter what path we take. The question is not, is there a perfect solution? I don't think so. I think there's a best solution, and the best solution is to end the means of mass murder, to stop and to adopt what we've been asked to by the oppressed Palestinian people, which is to do no harm and to stop supplying weapons. And that is now, as you know, in the most recent vote, more Democrats in Congress, whose ranks you hope to join, voted to end, in support of the amendment to end funding U.S. transfers of military to Israel, than voted for it. So this is becoming a mainstream Democratic position. It'll be more of a mainstream Democratic position when you're in Congress, if you're successful in this campaign.
Brad, you mentioned that, we're coming up on an hour and a half here. We should probably start wrapping things up. Let me get your sort of closing thoughts here tonight.
As I mentioned at the top of the discussion, I really appreciated my previous discussion with Dan. I really appreciate Dan, you coming back and this thoughtful discussion and exchange of perspectives. Scott, I appreciate you hosting this and facilitating. I really appreciate all of that. The perspective that I have is that we've got to stop putting Band-Aids on a lot of problems, and this is one of them that people tend to look at a surface level and they make a decision and they go on. And I am not, as I said before, I'm not pro-Palestinian. I'm not reflexively supporting of Israel. I'm looking at what's in the best interest of the United States, and we need to act in a way that matches our values. And what's happening in Palestine right now does not match our values, right? And I need to be able to explain in less than an hour and a half why to many people
more
that
than
are
a soundbite, but less than an hour and a half.
Right.
Gotta find that sweet spot.
I have to be able to explain to people, number one, why it doesn't match our values, because many people don't see the disconnect. And then number two, we need to act in a way that leads. You talked about 50 years from now. That 50 years from now, people will look back and go, that was a really well played diplomatic solution to a long-term, really difficult problem, instead of saying, yeah, that went really bad and it was just another chapter in what we're still facing today. This is a problem that we have a moral responsibility to put our sense of values and justice into action, and we need to move things forward. I'm not going to say here today that I am going to vote to end all support for Israel. I'm not going to say that I'm going to vote in favor of any particular bill or set of bills in support of Israel. All I'm saying is, what I will do is make sure that it matches our values and it moves us and them in a direction that there's a long-term and stable peace.
Dan, we've had a thoughtful, nuanced discussion here tonight. We agreed on some things. We didn't agree on other things. For folks who maybe didn't hear everything they wanted to hear from Brad, is it still okay to vote for him in November?
It is, I vote for people I disagree with when I think electing them will make the world better. And, if you're asking me Brad Meyer versus, what is her name? Erin Houchin?
Yeah.
It ain't close. I mean, I'm sorry, Brad, that you it's so easy because it's not fair. There are better people we could compare you to that might make it tougher, but she really doesn't. She's awful on this issue. I can't think of an issue she's isn't awful on. She is supporting violations of the First Amendment. I mean, don't get me on and by the way, I jokingly call her my BFF because I call her office sometimes 2 or 3 times a week to make clear how strongly I disagree with her. So yes, we have a choice between 2 candidates. I don't think there's any question that Brad is the better of these 2 candidates. And also, I don't just mean that minimally. I have really valued and respected the way Brad has participated in 2 discussions in which, there are people who don't enjoy my challenging their views and who avoid that because they tell me I'm pretty tough. So I have valued and really respected, and that's a lot more than just better than Erin Houchin. I really have valued, and again, as I said at the beginning, I really know that Brad approaches this with good faith and disagrees with me in good faith. For my own closing comments, what I would say is, and I think this coincides with Brad's comment about our values, I am pro-freedom. I am pro-equality. I am pro-universal human rights. And all of these are values that were passed on to me by my parents and grandparents as Jewish values, may their memories be for blessings, and as people who had, various connections to the Holocaust and the pogroms at the beginning of the 20th century. And all of those Jewish values of freedom, equality, social justice, universal human rights, and dignity for all persons are why I'm pro-equality, pro-freedom, and I'm pro the Palestinian solidarity movement.
Well, very good. Very deep, very nuanced topic. We've been here for an hour and a half, and even then, I think we've only scratched the surface. But gentlemen, thank you for allowing me to host this discussion. Thank you for sharing the space with me. Brad Meyer, Dan Segal, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank both of you. And Brad, I really meant that. I really appreciate the integrity of your participation.
Thank you, sir. This is an important topic, and I'm glad we had this discussion, and we could do it in a public forum.
And I hope we'll be doing it again when you are the next congressman from the 9th District.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Once again, that was Brad Meyer, Democratic candidate for Indiana's 9th Congressional District, and Dan Segal, retired professor of history and anthropology and an activist with Jewish Voice for Peace Indiana. Full show notes, transcripts, and links are available at progressiveindiana.net. You can find all of my work there, as well as that of other left-leaning Hoosier voices. We can't do it without your support, so please consider contributing to Who's Left and the wider network with a paid subscription if you're able. This independent media project relies solely on the generosity of kind patrons like you to make this information available for free to everybody. Please follow PIN at Progressive Indiana Network on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at the same handle, and over on Blue Sky and TikTok, find us at PIN Indiana. Sunday morning, I'll be live at 10:30 a.m. for Who's Left This Week, Indiana's only unapologetically progressive Sunday morning politics show. Brad will be a panelist on this week's episode, along with progressive organizer and medical doctor Megan Alderman. We'll discuss the week's top Indiana stories, plus U.S. and international news through a Hoosier lens. I wouldn't be surprised if this topic comes up again. Tune in on YouTube, Facebook Live, or Substack on the Progressive Indiana Network channel. Thanks for joining us. Connect with me online at who'sleft.us on Blue Sky, Instagram, and Threads, at Who's Left on all the rest. Direct message me at any of those sites with feedback, tips, ideas, and concerns, or email me at scott@who'sleft.us. Finally, please forward the show to a friend and have them pass it on too. Let's keep building this project and a truly democratic state one conversation at a time. Until the next one, this has been a special presentation of the Who's Left podcast. I'm Scott Aaron Rogers. Love each other, Indiana.